Hello, my name is Jordan Poss. I'm the author of the novel Griswoldville, which is a novel that takes place during the American Civil War in Georgia. In this section that I'm reading, this is from part 2 of the story relatively early on, part 2 called The Pistol, in which the narrator, Georgie Wax, who at this time is a 12 and 13-year-old boy, son of a yeoman farming family in Madison County, Georgia, awaits the return of his father from Virginia, where he's serving in the Georgia infantry, and also just kind of copes with the changes to life on the farm and life on the home front. And even as sheltered as the Georgia home front is for much of the war until right near the end, he notices changes both to accumulating both in his own life as well as in Georgia. These are just faint rumblings of what is about to come down upon them. So in this passage, you're going to see him, his cousins, Wes and Cal, as well as some other relatives, his grandfather, who is living with he and his mother and his brothers on their farm, trying to help keep the place afloat with his father gone, and just a few incidents that he recalls. Georgie is narrating this as a much older man much later. The next years passed. Time got away from us in the interlocking cycles and epicycles of the yeoman life. The daily routine of early rising, breakfast, chores, and labor. Play if we had time, supper, and time reading with my grandfather. The weekly routine of church and meals and with family at our farm, Wes and Cal's or my grandfather's with Aunt Laura, followed by the 6 days of labor decreed for man these many millennia. And the seasons with the hunts and slaughters and play of the winter giving way to the plow, hoe, and scythe for most of the year. With the last frost, we set to work plowing and planting, and as the cool mornings disappeared, we would break a sweat walking out the door in the morning. The sky over the furrowed red hills blanched white, and the air grew heavy with heat and moisture, and we hastened through our chores when possible and spent the late afternoons cooling off in the pond or the creek, where we could distract ourselves catching crawfish, salamanders, or turtles. When at last the heat began to drain away and the whited sky turned blue, we brought in the oats and corn. Then came slaughter, first at our farm and then at Wes and Cal's, and then the winter. My grandfather took me hunting, and in the following year instructed James in shooting too. And so on again the next year, with us growing and reaping and my father so far away. Beginning in the late summer of 1862, I sprang up some 5 inches. My voice deepened, hesitantly at first, before bellying out much later, after the war, and strange things happened to my body. I took more notice of the girls at church and school and about the country, and but was too ashamed to talk to them. I noticed in particular the unattainable, Eliza McBean, daughter of Thomas McBean, planter, lawyer, and by the end of '62, major of volunteer infantry. She and her elder brother Pritchard, who was a year and a half my senior, took to long horseback rides through the countryside around their plantation. I saw them sometimes when I had to run to Dawes's store, or walking to Quinn or my granddaddy's farm. She rode always impeccably dressed, if not in the great state of the large planters of the Black Belt, and had long wavy auburn hair and freckles. Ladies considered freckles a blemish in those days, but I confess, they did something powerful to me. I looked forward to seeing her and her brother on the road. I do not believe I ever spoke to Eliza before the war ended, but Pritchard will figure in my story again. We felt other changes as a family. My father continued to write letters, but they arrived erratically, sometimes in batches covering 3 months at a stretch, with gaps in his narrative where we had already received a letter from between the new arrivals. We began to lose track of him from afar. The newspapers did not help in accordance with their nature, especially as reports of vastly bloodier campaigns arrived, on the peninsula, and then Maryland, and again in Virginia at Fredericksburg, and in the spring and summer following, both Virginia and Pennsylvania, and in just enough detail to know nothing. When my father's letters did come, they reassured us that he and those he knew were whole, but little else. For example, September 25th, 1862. Dearest Mary, I write to you from Virginia, having returned from Maryland. We are well despite a fight of some proportions up there in Union territory. We was spared the thick of it, thank God, and our gravest hardship is want of food and shoes, which is a blessing all things considered. Quinn is newly recovered from a stomach complaint and sends his thanks for the chimney soot remedy you taught me some years ago. The regiment has had 3 days' rest, and the talk is of quiet till spring. I have put in for a furlough, but there is no talk of anyone getting them this year. I saw General Lee himself on the march, and a fine old man he is. I will write again as soon as possible. Thank your daddy for me, and kiss the boys. John Wax. One would never divine from this missive that my father had lived through the near entrapment and destruction of the army in a bend of the Potomac at Sharpsburg. Not that my father intended to deceive us. Far from it. Other changes stole upon us. With a few years of conscription, as my grandfather had predicted, the manhood in the county thinned out, and foot traffic along our road increased as families attempted to work multiple farms at once. The Reverend Asbridge left Barber's Chapel to serve as a chaplain with a regiment in the West. As we no longer planted cotton, we planted more beans or potatoes or simply let the cotton acres lie fallow. Prices of goods climbed as the several states of the CSA issued paper currency, and a dollar didn't go nearly as far as it had just 2 or 3 years previous. Merchants like Mr. Dawes began shamefacedly to insist on payment in specie. We felt the pinch, enough so that even I was aware of it in the prayers of my mother and the hard calculation in my grandfather's eyes when he looked across our fields of a midsummer's day, assessing. But we ate well enough, and what we needed but didn't already have we could borrow from family or neighbors. War, thus far, was an onerous inconvenience, but not ruinous, and still my father lived. Others did not enjoy such luck. Ned Kirk and Isaiah Medford, acquaintances of my father and grandfather, with farms a few miles away, died in the spring campaigning of 1863. Another, John Woodley, returned that summer with a leg missing below the knee. Reports and rumor, exchanged at the store or at church, ran rampant, of whom had been wounded or taken sick, how and whether they would live. Mrs. Neal received word in August 1863 that her husband had died of dysentery. A cousin came out to oversee the sale of their farm for her, and she left for her in-law's farm with her, now 7, orphan children in tow. Horace Magruder, called up from the ranks of the poor whites to the infantry a year after my apology, died when a Yankee cannonball struck him full in the face at Salem Church. The same ball maimed 3 others, only 2 of whom made it home. Despite my regret and inquiries after the war, I never learned what became of Horace's widow or children. 3 visits stand out to me from about this time. The first came during the stay of my Emmanuel County cousins Grace and Elizabeth Wax in May and June of 1863. My Uncle Henry had been gravely wounded in the slaughter at Malvern Hill. He had, with his regiment, advanced into Yankee crossfire, when, with his regiment, been mown down. He had dragged himself wheezing from the field with 3 shots through the musculature of his thighs and a perforated lung, a sucking chest wound. The surgeons pronounced it a miracle that he had lived. Today I find it more a miracle that the Minié balls that struck him had all missed the femur, limiting themselves to massive tissue damage. Had any one of them struck bone, he would lie to this day in an unmarked grave in the field. That was July 1st, 1862. The following spring, Henry, whose wounds had still not fully closed, took a turn for the worse. He lay dying from late April onward, and my Aunt Dinah, in hysterics, according to my cousins, distributed their children among family. Grace and Elizabeth, known as Bit, traveled up from Swainsboro to stay with us. They were bright, pretty girls who strongly resembled my brothers and were similar in age. Jefferson and Bit got along particularly well, and for those few weeks were inseparable. They helped in our mother's chores where they could, and generally enlivened the farm with their chatter, which was endless, but of an innocence and good humor which did not make it burdensome. My mother, for her part, seemed greatly to enjoy having daughters for a few weeks, and fussed over their hair and the particulars of their dress. The girls beamed when she did so. They had not gotten much attention at home for nigh on a year. Yet Grace and Bit are not who I mean when I remark that a visit from this time stands out vividly to me. I mean the man who came to fetch them when Henry recovered. My Uncle Henry, miraculously, rose from his bed one day and, so family lore has it, said, "I'll be goddamned if I'm going to lay there and die like a goddamned cripple. I'm tired of laying there. Where are my breeches?" And traipsed outside in his sweat-sodden and pus-crusted long underwear and set to work in the garden. Henry was an irascible man, nor was he church-going. Thereafter Henry recovered but for a permanent halt in his step. "Where are my breeches?" became a recurrent joke in our family, and the Emmanuel County Waxes sent a hired man to escort the girls home. I cannot recall the man's name, but he stood over 6 feet tall and looked like he'd cured in the smokehouse too long. He plodded and had a schoolmasterly air about him. I believe I heard he had been a seminarian at one point but had run out of money. He stayed overnight with us and departed with the girls the next day. My grandfather and I drove them into Athens to the train station, which was for me a great and distracting adventure. But I marked something else odd about this wizened man, his speech. Even Jefferson noted later that he talked funny. He drawled more than was usual in our county, and spoke breathily, lighting gingerly on his vowels and pronouncing them just differently enough for mere boys to notice. When I asked my grandfather about it, he said the man came from Savannah. He had known the moment the man opened his mouth. I puzzled over this for some time, and realized that I had noted peculiarities in Grace and Bit's speech as well. I knew enough of the wider world to know that people from far away spoke strangely, but my family, Grace and Bit, and the lean hireling all came from Georgia. Could Georgia be so large that the people spoke with discernible differences in different parts of the state? I asked my grandfather. Well, yes, Georgia is a big state, one of the biggest, matter of fact, and people do talk different in different parts, but it don't take much of a distance to put space between the ways people talk. What do you mean? You go up in the mountains up near North Carolina, seems like the folks up there talk different in about every hollow. You might not even understand some of them, Georgie. I marveled at this and returned to it many times over as I went about my work. I would have cause to ponder it again. The second visit I recall in particular detail was with Pritchard McBean, whom I have already mentioned, scion of the nearest plantation. As I have related, Pritchard was a year and a half my elder, and though of an entirely different class, we did know one another well enough to say hello in passing, though I had not yet found the temerity to say hello to his sister. He was a well-built, ruddy boy whose jaw had already squared off above a bull neck by the time he joined the cavalry. I had heard somehow that he had joined up and was to head west to help in the campaign near Chattanooga when we met one day near Dawes's store. It was late summer of '63. It was not quite time to bring the corn in, and so when my chores were done, I had as much as remained of the afternoon to myself. That day I had finished particularly early and made for Wes and Cal's. Pritchard and I crossed paths in the low-lying place where my grandfather and I had walked through the morning fog 2 years before, over a brick culvert through which ran the creek that fed our pond further down. Pritchard rode high on his favorite stallion, the finest horse left on their plantation after his father had taken many of them and the Confederate States of America had requisitioned others, and he was in uniform. Eliza did not ride with him this time, but his manservant, what the British call a valet or batman, a dark, heavy, bearded Negro of 25 or 30 named Anchises, rode a dappled mare beside him. I nodded and touched the brim of my hat, broad-brimmed, unmilitary, weather-beaten. "Pritchard," I said. "Anchises?" "George Wax," he said. "Young Master Wax," Anchises said. "Right fine uniform, Pritchard," I said. I was excited. I had seen plenty of uniforms, though most of them had been pretty shabby for the last year or so, but the thought of someone mine own age in uniform, off to the war. I took it in. He wore a finely tailored shell coat with yellow cuffs and collar, and his own fine riding boots in soft tan leather to the knee. He wore a blue-gray kepi with the chin strap tied under his jaw. A steel cavalry saber clattered at his thigh, and all his brass buttons, buckles, and tack shone burnished in the summer sun. I thought of gleaming armor, of my conversation with my grandfather about knights, of my dream of the pecan grove. I grinned. Pritchard narrowed his eyes. "Something funny, Master Wax?" I realized he may have taken my remarks as sarcasm. "No, no, you're just a sight." Pritchard looked at me. Anchises looked at Pritchard. "I mean it, and to think, somebody our own age." "Well, you do what you got to." I nodded. "What outfit you joining?" "Wheeler's Cavalry." "Fighting Joe, my word." "Well, I aim to fight. I wanted to go to Virginia with my papa and fight for General Lee, but they need me here." "I imagine." "Yes, sir, I'm proud to defend the state of Georgia. The Yankee invader will rue the day he crosses swords with us." I whistled. My enthusiasm was manifest, and I feared embarrassing. But I was overcome with excitement. I nodded and grinned like a simpleton. Pritchard saved me. He looked off to the horizon like some hero in a book plate. "Well, George, I'll be seeing you." "Yes, sir," I found myself saying. "Farewell. Godspeed." "Thank you, George. Let's go, Anchises." Anchises tipped his hat as he passed. "Master Wax." I nodded and watched them go. Private McBean jangled and winked and flashed uphill and out of sight. I dashed the rest of the way to Wes and Cal's and related every detail. Wes screwed up his face when I told them. "Shit, he's been riding around 3 days now hoping people will talk to him about his uniform." I balked at Wes's language. He had begun precociously to experiment in obscenity after listening in on the old men at the store and had gotten a few soapy mouthwashings from my Aunt Ellen for it. "You don't say." "Yeah," Cal said. "He's awful full of himself." "Puffed up," Wes said. "Yeah, but how about that uniform?" "How about it?" they said. "Forget for a minute Pritchard McBean was wearing it," I said. "Wasn't it smart? Didn't he look most like a soldier?" Wes and Cal looked at each other. "Well," Wes said. I clapped my hands and pointed at them, victorious. "Yes, and think of it. Boys our own age going off to fight. In uniform, Wes. In uniform, Cal." This had not occurred to them, and deeply impressed them as it had me, to my regret. The final of the 3 visits came October 15, 1863, and it was the greatest surprise and the most melancholy. As with the receipt of my father's first letter from Virginia, I recall the date precisely because, in this case, the visit occurred the day after my 13th birthday. We were about to sit down to breakfast when the man arrived. Mr. Dawes brought him in his wagon and stood by while we spoke. When I first spotted them rounding the bend, coming up the road from the direction of the wheelwrights and Mr. Hale's farms, I knew something unusual had happened. Mr. Dawes never absented himself from his store on a weekday. I shouted to my mother and grandfather when we all stood assembled in the yard by the shade tree, but a moment later, something bade us wait. Mr. Dawes reined up his team in the yard, and the man lowered himself from the seat. He stood a rangy 5'5", with long, thin hair, a long, bony nose and high cheekbones, and a long, thinly bearded face. He regarded us in our gathering shyly, and held his hat, a shapeless slouch hat with a faded blue infantryman's hat cord, in both hands. He worked it nervously with his knuckles. "Mrs. Wax," he said at last, and I realized that what my grandfather had told me earlier in the year about accents. This man's voice wavered between throaty and nasal, and he had drawn our family name out to a full 2 syllables. Even his speech was long. I listened the more intently for being distracted. "I'm Mary Wax," my mother said. "This is my father, Lafayette Eschenbach." My grandfather stepped forward and shook the man's hand. "You can call me Fate." "Abraham, ma'am, sir. Abraham Keener." He bore down hard on his R's, chewing on them, pronouncing each and every one unlike the folks of our area. "You have news for us, Mr. Keener?" my grandfather said. "Yes, sir, of a kind, and you can call me Abraham, sir." "You serve with my husband, John Wax?" my mother said. I noticed she had pulled my younger brothers in close to her skirts, and I forgot, for a moment, the man's accent. "Not rightly, no," he said. "I was with the 24th Georgia, Company E, Rabun Gap Rifles. That's us out of Rabun County, up north yonder." "Yes, sir," my grandfather said. "I've been there once or twice. Lovely country." Keener seemed to relax. He shifted his weight and grinned shyly. His teeth looked poorly, and I noted bright red gums. The edges of his eyelids were red and inflamed as well. The man had made this trip, though wholly unwell to travel. "Yes, sir, that it is, and I can't wait to get back. My connection to John... See here." He looked at his feet and reached for words. "Well, I'll just come out with it. We was wounded, the both of us." My mother made a choking sound and stiffened. Keener raised his hands. "He's all right. He was all right last I seen him." My grandfather took him by the shoulders and beckoned him inside. "No, sir, I reckon I shouldn't. I'm a little poorly, to tell you the truth." "Then here, have a seat on the porch step." "Thank you, sir. I appreciate it." Keener sat, and my grandfather offered him tobacco. He filled and lit his pipe and seemed at real ease at last. "Tell us your story, Mr. Keener," my mother said. "Just tell it to us right on through from the beginning." "Yes, ma'am." He took a drag on his pipe. "Y'all done heard of Gettysburg by now. Well, I got myself hit in the attack as we passed on through this wheat field there. Canister shot from this ridge yonder coming right down on us as we moved up. I took shots through this calf here and one through the middle right here." He clapped a hand against his left side below the armpit. I saw when he did so how thin he was under his clothes, which I now recognized as the remnant of a uniform. "Took a bite out in my leg and busted a couple of ribs. Wasn't too bad as compared with some of what I seen happen to boys in my company, but I couldn't hardly walk, and so 2 boys drugged me back to the rear and I wound up in a hospital. Surgeons fixed me up and laid me in a barnyard. I was lucky there, too. Got a spot in the afternoon shade. Yes, ma'am, it was hot, and that shade might have saved my life. Well, I slept a bit and woke a bit, especially when I got hungry, but wasn't nothing to eat, so I mostly just laid there. Right along about sunset they brung in your husband, John, ma'am." He hesitated and took refuge in a slow pull on his pipe. My mother said, "Don't spare me nothing, Mr. Keener. I brought these 3 boys into the world right here in this house. I can hear what happened to my husband here just as easy." Keener did not look at her, but nodded. "Well, John, he looked pretty busted up. Seems he caught some canister shot, too, and something else besides. Surgeons told me they took a couple of pistol balls out in his shoulder and chest. Whatever he got up to it good and close. The canister had struck him above the hip and below the ribs here, and they was worried it tore through his stomach and he'd get took off by sepsis or the gangrene. They told me straight out I wasn't to give him no water or nothing, just in case. Well, night come on, and the boys around me in that yard was crying something pitiful. They was still cutting on him in the tents, too. You ain't never smelled nothing like that. John, he commenced a-groaning. He was thirsty, he said, and needed water. I told him what the surgeons done said, and he made me to know in no uncertain terms that he needed water. Not that he was ever rude, you understand, ma'am. He was only ever a gentleman, even in pain." My mother smiled through her tears and nodded, mouthed, "Go on." "Well," I said, "well, I reckon the least I could do was give this man some water. I thought on the rich man and Lazarus, and I thought if I didn't dip my finger in some water for this poor man, I might just wind up needing a drink myself, if you follow me. So I give him a sip from my canteen, and he near guzzled it down. I prayed mercy on me for maybe killing this man. The bandages on his stomach was something frightful, but nothing ever come of it. In fact, he quieted down and slept. Next day I give him more water, since I was getting around better than him, and we shared some hardtack and whatever else we could come by. He told me he was from Georgia, too, and I'd be lying if I didn't say that was joyous news. You spend a lot of time with Alabamians and Texans? Well, the day after that we was heading back for Virginia. I seen a lot of boys die on that march. Retreat's hard on the wounded, and others fall back and get captured, but I told myself I couldn't very well let a fellow Georgian fall behind or die, so we looked after each other all the way to the Potomac. After that we made it into a good hospital. I was patching up just fine, no infections, they told me, and got around on a crutch pretty good. John was getting better, too. Took a while, but they let me out and gave me a furlough for disability and re-enlisting to boot. Before I left, John asked me to see y'all on my way home. Don't worry, it ain't too far out of the way. and to give you all this so you'd know he was all right. Keener produced a thick letter and handed it to my mother, who rose, nodded, stuck it into her apron, and smoothed Jefferson's hair. At last she took a deep breath and looked at the man. "I'm most grateful, Mr. Keener." "You're welcome, ma'am." "Most grateful," my grandfather added, and shook Keener's hand again. "Where do you go from here, Mr. Keener?" "On up north, ma'am. Railroad don't run to Rabun County, so it's walking or wagons where I can get 'em." "Is it a hard road?" Keener grinned slyly. "Ain't much of a road at all, to tell the truth, and they's some mountains and a good-sized gorge between here and there, but I know the country. It's home, after all." "You wait here," my mother said. She left my brothers, grandfather, and I there on the porch with Keener, and Mr. Dawes watching at a respectful distance, and entered the house. The door sighed shut behind her. My grandfather offered Keener his tobacco pouch. "Take the rest of it with you." "I appreciate it," Keener said. My grandfather nodded to me. "This here is George, John's oldest." I stepped forward and offered my hand. "Thank you, Mr. Keener." "Abraham, please. Pleased to meet you, Georgie. Your daddy's right proud of you looking after the place." My heart could have burst, not merely with pride, but with missing my father. "Thank you, Abraham." My grandfather nodded to my brothers and introduced them as well. "Tell Mr. Keener thank you for coming. He come a long way to tell us your daddy's all right." My brothers thanked him. Jefferson seemed to want to cry. Keener leaned in close. He was a frightful sight, but my little brother did not flinch or back away. "You miss your daddy?" "Yes, sir." "He'll be home soon enough. He's doing this for y'all, you understand?" "Yes, sir." "He's a good man. You be proud to have such a daddy. They don't stamp men like him out in factories." He settled back on the step and seemed to sink in on himself a little. He puffed on the pipe. Some of our chickens bestirred themselves in the yard and pecked at the quiet sunlight. Mr. Dawes's horse shifted idly in the traces. At length my grandfather said, "Has it been hard fighting?" Keener tamped another pipeful and appraised my grandfather. At last he looked away and said, "Yes, sir." My mother returned with our entire breakfast wrapped and bundled. In the October morning air it began to steam through the cloths my mother had folded around it. "You take this on with you," she said. "We got plenty." Keener raised his hands and shook his head. "Oh, now, Mrs. Wax. You take it, Mr. Keener. It's been hard, but not that hard. We can't say thank you enough." Keener rose and accepted the food. "Thank you, ma'am." "Thank you." We saw him to Mr. Dawes's wagon. Mr. Dawes tipped his hat and rode away with him. I have neither heard of or from Abraham Keener since. I imagine he would be well into his 90s by now, should he have survived the war. When they had gone, Jefferson looked at my mother. "Is Daddy hurt?" "He was hurt, Jefferson. Mr. Keener came to tell us he'll be all right. God seen him through it." "Was he bad hurt?" "Sounds like it." Jefferson hugged my mother about the waist and rested his cheek against her hip. She patted his head and looked off down the road where Mr. Dawes and Keener had gone. James spoke up. "Is that a letter from Daddy?" "It is," my mother said. "Can we read it? Now, this time?" She seemed to brace herself and nodded. "All right, let's get on inside. I'll fix y'all something simple for breakfast." "Ain't there nothing left?" I said. My mother gave me a look that withered me. "Shame, Georgie Wax. Ain't nobody here needed that food more than Mr. Keener. Think on what he done for us, for your daddy." I blushed and stammered. I had not meant it that way, but any response would have been inadequate. I remembered my father's praise of me, relayed through Mr. Keener, and felt more a child than ever. I had, in some way, let my father down in the instant of his pride. I followed everyone into the house. My grandfather patted me on the back as we sat down to the table, and I hid my face. Shortly, my mother gave us plates of grits and stale cornbread. She gave the letter to my grandfather. We ate in silence, and then he read to us before we set to work. September 12, 1863, Richmond, Virginia. Dearest Mary, I am sending this letter on with a friend and fellow Georgian, Abraham Keener. He done a lot for me, as I will relate to you some day. I know you will treat him right. I have been grievously wounded in the fighting up north. I feared for my life and the lives of you, Mary, and our boys who I miss so dearly, and I had a hard time of it. But I am thankful to report that I am getting better, and the surgeons tell me I no longer walk through the valley of the shadow of death, so I may fear no evil. Be that as it may, I am still not whole, and do not expect to be for some time. It is so hard to be away. I aim to request a furlough, but cannot expect to get it. It is money I must not spend before I get it. I hope to see you and the boys again soon, none the less, be that on furlough or when this war is over. I would give all for it to be so. Many has already. I have much more I mean to write or say to you, Mary, but I hope this letter will suffice. Abraham tells me he will leave on a furlough of his own in the morning, and he has agreed to see this letter delivered into your own fair hand. Greet the boys and your daddy for me. John Wax. I looked over the letter when my grandfather finished reading it through. My father's hand, I could not help but note, was large and shaky. My mother's prayers increased in frequency and intensity. 3 months later, after hunting and the slaughter and curing of our hogs, and long after the end of harvest, my father came home. Thank you for taking the time to watch and listen. I hope you enjoyed that excerpt from my novel Griswoldville. You can find out more about it on my personal website, my website about me and my books, jordanmposs.com. Griswoldville is available in both paperback and Kindle on Amazon.com. So if you liked what you heard, please order yourself a copy and give it a read. Thanks.